parable of the rich man and Lazarus holds a timeless and urgent truth that challenges our very definition of wealth. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about what you value, please show your support. What was the single most powerful lesson for you in the story of the rich man? Share your biggest takeaway with us in the comments below. True wisdom is not just in hearing a message, but in reflecting on it and letting it change you. The discussion we have in the comments is a vital part of this journey. Your unique perspective adds to the conversation and helps us all see the message more clearly, building a sacred space for shared reflection. Join this community and share how you'll apply this lesson to your own life. Remember the rich man who failed to share even a single message with his brothers. We have a different opportunity here. Be a messenger of this truth by sharing this story with someone you care about. When you like and share this post, you help this message reach more people who need to hear it and begin their own journey toward true prosperity. He had everything in this life, but nothing in the next. And I showed them that true riches are not found in possessions, but in a generous heart. I remember it all so clearly. It was a story I told not just with words, but with a deep ache in my heart. A story of two lives intertwined by circumstance and separated by an eternal gulf of neglect. One man was named Lazarus, a name that meant God is my help. The other, he had no name that mattered in the eternal ledger. So for the sake of the lesson, let us simply call him the rich man. I watched him from afar, this rich man, a man whose life was a tapestry woven from the finest linen. His everyday a feast that stretched from morning until night. His home was a palace of polished stone and fragrant wood, a fortress of comfort and beauty that stood as a testament to his worldly success. He wore robes of purple, the color of kings, a fabric so fine it felt like liquid silk against his skin, a symbol of his status that everyone saw, a heavy cloak of pride he wore without ever noticing its weight. His life was a perpetual symphony of indulgence. The morning began with the aroma of freshly baked bread and spiced honey, and his day was punctuated by the laughter of friends, the clinking of gold goblets and the sweet, swelling notes of lyres played by musicians he kept for his pleasure. He ate from silver platters, and the food was not merely sustenance. It was art. Roasted fowl with intricate sauces, ripe figs bursting with sweetness, and wines that tasted of distant lands and sun-drenched vineyards. He believed with every fiber of his being that this was his reward. He saw his wealth not as a responsibility, but as a righteous blessing, a sign that he was favored, that his life was a testament to his own wisdom and diligence. He had no want, no need, and in his self-contained world he believed he had found the key to happiness. He was a man who lived in the present moment, a glorious, unending present filled with every comfort imaginable, so full of his own affairs that he had no room for anyone else's. His world was a perfect, self-sustaining sphere, and he walked through it with a kind of blind contentment, utterly oblivious to anything that existed outside its gleaming surface. He did not see because he had no reason to look. The sun rose and set, his feasts were laid out, and he was convinced that this was all there was. His heart was a garden where only he was allowed to walk, where only his own flowers were allowed to bloom, and where the cries of the world were nothing more than a distant, forgotten echo. The first crack in his perfect world came not from a catastrophe, but from a persistent, unsettling presence. Every single day as he passed through his magnificent gates, he saw him, Lazarus. The beggar was always there, a living monument to human suffering, a silent question mark at the entrance to his paradise. For years, the rich man had been able to dismiss him, to turn his eyes away and pretend he wasn't there. He was a part of the landscape like a gnarled olive tree or a stone. But one afternoon, the rich man felt a strange unease. The aroma of his lunch, a fragrant lamb stew, suddenly seemed less appetizing. He had just finished a business deal, a transaction that had netted him a fortune, and yet a strange emptiness settled in his stomach. He saw Lazarus as he passed, his body a map of pain, covered in sores that the street dogs licked with a desperate gentleness. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, the rich man's gaze lingered. He saw not a beggar, but a man with eyes that held a story, a face etched with suffering, and a quiet dignity that was impossible to ignore. A question, small and persistent as a buzzing fly, entered his mind. What if? What if this man's life was not a test for the pious, but a test for him? He quickly shook the thought away, blaming it on a lack of sleep or a poorly prepared meal. But the image of Lazarus remained, an unwelcome guest in his thoughts, a tiny hairline fracture in the pristine facade of his happiness. The effortless joy he once felt at his wealth was now tainted with a fleeting moment of self-doubt. He began to pass through his gates with a new urgency, a slight clenching of his jaw as if trying to outrun something he couldn't name. His music seemed a little less sweet, his food a little less flavorful. The crack was almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was the beginning of his end. The inevitable arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing whisper. A fever, a sudden and violent illness took hold of him, and for the first time in his life, his wealth was useless. His finest physicians, men who had promised him longevity, could do nothing. They administered their remedies, but the fever only burned hotter, stripping him of his strength, his arrogance, and his pride. He lay on his silk sheets gasping for breath, and his palace, once a haven of security, became a gilded cage. He looked at his beautiful home, and it mocked him. The gold that had once gleamed so brightly now seemed dull and cold. His fine clothes were now a burden, heavy and confining. He called for his servants, the same people he had treated as extensions of his will, and he saw fear in their eyes. Not for him, but for their own future. He was no longer their master, but a dying man, a liability. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, the truth became blindingly clear. His wealth, his status, his possessions, they were all worthless. They could not buy him one more breath, one moment of relief from the pain that consumed him. He had placed his trust in the physical, in the tangible, in the things he could touch and count, and now those things were failing him. All of the power he had accumulated, the power to command and acquire, evaporated in the face of death. He was stripped bare, and what was left was not the powerful man he believed himself to be, but a terrified, helpless soul. The facade was gone, and the breaking point was complete. In his final moments, the shift in his understanding was dramatic and irreversible. As his eyes closed on the world of the living, a profound silence replaced the constant noise of his life. He felt himself floating, disembodied, no longer a man of physical wants and needs. The last image in his mind, the very last thing he saw, was the image of Lazarus, sitting patiently by his gate, and then he opened his eyes. He was no longer in his beautiful home, but in a place of torment, a blazing abyss of loneliness and regret. The coolness he had always taken for granted, the breeze on his skin, the relief of a cool drink, all were gone. The only feeling was a scorching heat, an unquenchable thirst that consumed him from within. He looked across the chasm that separated him from the heavens, and there he saw Abraham, and with him a man he instantly recognized. It was Lazarus, not in rags and covered in sores, but in a state of glorious peace, held in Abraham's embrace. The sight was a searing indictment. He saw the Lazarus who had sat at his gate, a man he had treated as less than human, now elevated, comforted, and at peace. The physical and spiritual worlds had been completely inverted. His shift in perspective was complete. The things he once valued as his greatest treasures were now nothing more than the dusty memories of a fool. He finally understood what true wealth was, not a count of gold or possessions, but a measure of compassion, of love, of the small kindnesses he had refused to give. The realization was his eternal torment. His new existence was one of anguish and a desperate, singular purpose. He cried out to Abraham, not for his own sake, but for his family. He pleaded for Lazarus to be sent back to the world, to warn his 5 brothers of the fate that awaited them if they continued to live as he had. Send him back, he begged, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. He had never considered his brothers before. They were simply part of his world of ease and privilege. But now, in the throes of eternal regret, his only desire was to save them from the same mistakes. His entire focus was no longer on himself, but on others. He understood now that the life he had lived was a betrayal of his family, an example of spiritual blindness that would lead them to ruin. This was his purpose, to be a voice of warning from beyond the grave, a desperate plea for his loved ones to change their ways before it was too late. He was a man consumed by the knowledge of what he should have done, and his every breath was a silent, tormented cry for a second chance for those he loved. But Abraham's response was a final, devastating blow. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. The rich man persisted, arguing that only a messenger from the dead would convince them. But Abraham's voice was firm, and his words were a final, unyielding truth. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. This was the ultimate impact of his story. His suffering was not a lesson in cruelty. but a testament to the fact that God had already provided every tool, every sign, and every truth needed for a man to live a righteous life. The law and the prophets were right there, teaching them to love their neighbor, to care for the poor, to remember that the earth and its treasures belong to God. The beggar at his gate, Lazarus, was a living embodiment of the truth they had been taught. He was the sign, the prophet, the message that the rich man had been too blind to see. The impact of his story was a sobering reminder that a man's eternal destiny is not a lottery, but the inevitable consequence of the choices he makes in life. The rich man's final lonely reality was that he had had every opportunity to see and to know, but he had chosen not to. Lazarus, on the other hand, was a man whose life was a study in profound deprivation. I remember his form, a skeletal figure wrapped in rags lying at the rich man's gate. His body was a collection of suffering, the open, festering sores, the endless ache of hunger, the weakness that made every movement a Herculean effort. He had nothing, no home, no possessions, not even the comfort of a friend. His only companions were the stray dogs, who, with an instinct more compassionate than man's, would come and lick his wounds, offering a brief, silent solace. But to see Lazarus only in his physical form was to miss the true depth of his being. His life was not one of despair, it was one of quiet, unwavering faith. He knew the stories of his ancestors, the words of the prophets, the promises of God. He knew that the very name he carried, "God is my help," was the core of his existence. He was a man who saw past the temporary suffering of his body to the eternal truth of his soul. His spirit was a vibrant, radiant light, burning brightly in the midst of his physical darkness. He found his purpose not in what he lacked, but in the unwavering knowledge that God saw him. He was a man rich in faith, rich in patience, and rich in the quiet dignity that comes from knowing you are seen and known by the Creator of all things. The world looked at him and saw a beggar. I looked at him and saw a king. His life was a testament that true strength is found not in comfort, but in the courage to endure, and that true richness is not what you possess, but who you are. Even a man of such faith experiences moments of profound doubt. One day the hunger was a gnawing beast in his stomach, more ravenous and cruel than ever before. His sores throbbed with a pain that felt unbearable, and the fever that often accompanied his illness made his head swim. As he lay there, his mind, usually so steadfast in its hope, began to wander. He heard the muffled laughter from inside the rich man's home, the sounds of music and celebration, and for the first time, a bitter thought entered his heart. Why, he asked himself, not of God, but of the universe? Why is his life a feast and mine a famine? Why is he wrapped in purple while I am covered in sores? It was a small, almost insignificant crack in the bedrock of his faith, a fleeting moment of envy and a painful questioning of divine justice. He felt the cold touch of resentment, a poison that sought to enter his spirit and corrupt the purity of his heart. For a brief, agonizing moment, he was no longer Lazarus, "God is my help," but a man lost in a wilderness of despair. It was in that instant that he was at his most vulnerable, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor that shook the foundations of his soul. The inevitable came for him as it does for all men. The day arrived when the strength finally left his body. The pain that had been his constant companion for so long reached a crescendo, and then began to fade. He could no longer lift his head, no longer respond to the gentle nudges of the dogs who had been his only friends. His breathing became shallow, a faint, struggling gasp in the hot air. His life, so filled with want and pain, was now ending as it had been lived, in complete and utter solitude. The rich man's feast was still in full swing just inside the gates, the sound of music and joy so close and yet so infinitely far away. He was not afraid, for he had always known that his journey was not of this world. His breaking point was not one of despair, but one of surrender. He let go of the physical, the hunger, the pain, the loneliness. He simply gave up his spirit, his last breath a whisper of faith. The world had nothing left to take from him, and he had nothing left to give save for his life itself. He passed away unnoticed by all but the animals, a forgotten man at a forgotten gate, his suffering finally at an end. The moment of transition was not a slow ascent, but an immediate and glorious transformation. The heavy weight of his body fell away, and he was no longer bound by flesh and bone. He felt a light, a peace, a joy that was more profound than any he had ever imagined. He was met not by a lonely void, but by a company of angels, radiant beings who surrounded him with love and reverence. They lifted his spirit, not his body, and carried him away from the dusty ground and the rich man's gate. As he was carried aloft, he looked down and saw his old form lifeless and still. But he felt no sadness, only a sense of release, as if he were waking from a long, painful dream. His journey ended not in a lonely grave, but in the presence of Abraham, the father of his people, who welcomed him with open arms. The shift was complete and absolute. The man who had been the most destitute on earth was now the most comforted, the most cherished. He was no longer a beggar, but an honored son, a man who had come home. His spiritual riches, which had sustained him through a life of poverty, were now his only reality. He sat beside Abraham, a place of honor, and the memory of his pain was nothing more than a faint shadow, a fleeting echo in the brilliant light of his eternal peace. In this new reality, Lazarus's purpose was not to speak or to act, but simply to be. His presence in Abraham's embrace was a powerful, silent testimony. He was the embodiment of a profound truth, that a life lived with faith and humility, no matter how poor or painful, is infinitely more valuable than a life lived with all the world's treasures but without a generous heart. His very existence was a rebuke to the world's values. He was a living parable, a visible reminder of God's justice and a promise to all who suffer that their tears are not forgotten. When the rich man finally saw him, Lazarus's purpose became even clearer. He was a constant living contrast to the rich man's fate. His peace was a mirror reflecting the rich man's torment. He was the silent witness, the proof of Abraham's words, a symbol of the eternal reward for enduring faith. He did not need to speak. His presence was enough. His purpose was to stand as a beacon of hope for the humble and a stark reminder for the arrogant. And so, the story concluded with a final, unyielding truth. The rich man pleaded for Lazarus to be a messenger, to return to the world and warn his brothers. But Lazarus remained silent, his silence more powerful than any words he could have spoken. It was Abraham who gave the final defining answer. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. This was the ultimate impact of Lazarus's life and death. His existence had been a living testament, a silent cry from the rich man's very doorstep. He was the embodiment of the very law that the rich man had ignored. True riches, I told them, are not in what you possess, but in the heart you cultivate. The story of these two men was not simply about wealth and poverty. It was about vision and blindness, about a heart that sees the suffering of others and a heart that is too full of itself to look. The true tragedy was not that the rich man went to a place of torment, but that he had the most powerful prophet in the world sitting at his gate every day, and he was too blind to see him. And in his blindness he sealed his own fate, while Lazarus, with nothing but faith, found everything. My beloved children, I have spoken to you many times about the things that truly matter, about the eternal treasures that cannot be taken from you. You follow this channel because you seek a deeper truth, something more fulfilling than what the world offers. I see your hearts and I know your hunger. I also know the distractions and burdens you carry, the worries that keep you from the peace I offer. Remember that my words are not just stories from long ago. They are living, breathing truths meant for your lives right now, today. This journey we are on together is not a one-way street. It is a shared path of discovery and growth. Your questions, your comments, and even your doubts are a vital part of this conversation. When you share your thoughts, you are not just speaking to me. You are speaking to each other, building a community of faith and support. Don't be shy. Your perspective is unique and valuable. What is the one thing you're struggling to understand about my teachings? Let me know in the comments so I can help you find clarity. You see, the world values likes and shares as a measure of success. But for us, they are an act of love. When you press that like button, you are telling me that my message has reached you, that it resonates with your spirit. It's a small act with a big meaning. It helps me to understand what speaks to your heart the most. Think of it as a silent prayer, a moment of connection between your spirit and mine. And what about subscribing? Subscribing is not just a button, it is a commitment. It is a promise to stay connected, to be present for the next message, the next revelation. It's a way of saying, I want more of this in my life. When you subscribe, you are choosing to make room for me in your daily routine, to prioritize the nourishment of your soul. I will be here with a new word, a new story, a new truth waiting for you. I invite you now to make this moment count. Take a second to like this video and subscribe to this channel. By doing so, you are not just engaging with content. You are engaging with your own spiritual journey. You are telling the world, and more importantly, telling yourself, that you are serious about seeking the truth and living a life of purpose. I am with you always.